Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties, but also we typically start a little late to give people an opportunity to join. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We will be having a presentation from Avante Daniels. He is the founder of Seeker, a cultural intelligence firm that helps leaders and organizations turn cultural fluency into strategy. His work bridges research, design, and behavioral systems, translating cultural signals into decisions that move faster than trends. With over 20 years in media strategy and systems design, he's partnered with global brands and civic institutions to build clarity under pressure and make intelligence actionable in every room. He's also an alum of the University of Louisiana Lafayette. And with that, I will let you take it away, Evan.
Thank you, Francesca. It's so great to be here this morning. Good morning, everybody. It's very much morning over here on the West Coast. I'm based in San Francisco, so I'm really excited for us to get into this conversation today. Today, I'm going to share some of the focus around culture and what we really talk about when we talk about culture and how it impacts your work on a regular basis. As you have questions, please throw them into the chat, raise your hand, make sure to build out time so that we can really talk this through, because I want you to get as much of this as possible and be able to run with it as soon as possible too. Okay, let me get my screen share up. Okay, make sure that we're all good here.
And Evan, you're inviting people to have a dialogue, right?
Yes, please. Like, this is a conversation. We can't talk about culture without sharing perspectives between each other. And as much as what I'm trying to present today, the best teacher in the room is going to be shared perspective. So share your experiences, share your concerns, share your questions, but let's talk this out. So today, what we're dealing with is a cultural fluency lab. And of course, I'm going to explain what all of that means. But to get started and to get us used to asking questions, first off, how would you define culture? You can either put that into the chat or feel free to raise your hand and join the conversation.
Well, I'll jump in since nobody else is. Oh, wait, we have one person.
Yes, from Railroad Ave. Okay, how do we?
This is Laura with the Railroad Avenue Historic Cultural District. And I would define, hello, Francesca. Hello, leader of this group. I define culture as what makes us who we are. It's it defines me in so many ways.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good definition. I like that. I'm gonna have to borrow that one. I have some coming into the chat as well. Let's see what we've got here. Tara, you said culture is the currency exchanged between groups of people and individuals. Francesca, this is a really sharp group of people. This is going to be a great conversation today. Evelyn said something distinctive about groups of people. Yes, these are brilliant answers. These are brilliant answers. And honestly, here's the reason we ask, right? Is that and share cultures and traditions. Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I ask this question is because as you will deal with in your work, as I'm sure, there are plenty of definitions of culture. And depending on who you're talking to, that definition may be the exact same as yours, it may be completely different. And it's one of those words that gets used so often that if every now and then we don't say, what do you mean by that? Then we don't necessarily know where people are coming from. So we always want to establish a baseline. Now, at Seeker, we study culture through a lot of different lenses. We look at it through sociology, anthropology, politics, media, a lot of different things. And the definition that we use is very similar to yours. But here's how we drill it down to a basic piece. Culture is shared perception over time. And that may seem a little kind of like vague and airy, but really when you think about it, if you go to a parade, if you go to a festival, the things that you experience there with other people in that moment is going to create a feeling, a sense, right? It could make you enjoy what's going on, may not, but one way or another, you and a group of people are coming to the same conclusion through what you have experienced. Now, sometimes that's at a parade, but that can also be in a family household. That can be in an office place, right? Where we experience different things. We show up every day to work. We work with people on a regular basis, and we end up establishing values and traditions and customs built out of the shared experience. But everything comes back down to what we all do together. You can't have culture by yourself. And this is really important, right? That what happens in culture and what we define as culture, what builds culture, is what we all decide on together, whatever that group may be. And so as you're working in your communities, right, a lot of times when we're working with people, they have a different definition than culture than maybe we do as we're deeper into this work. And it's going to be their definitions that really drive and fill that space or even determine what that space looks like. So the question here, right, is if we know that culture is shaped by repeating experiences. I remember when I was living in Louisiana, the simple things of Mardi Gras break completely shapes how the rest of the year plays out. Crawfish season, hurricane season, drive-through daiquiri season. All of these things, determine exactly what's going to be going on in your life. Football season, right? Even if you're not a fan of LSU, you're still very much aware of LSU's prominence and presence in the state. And when LSU wins or loses, it changes how people show up to work the next day. We see culture all the time, right? And may decide on what we eat, what we don't. But the question that happens for us as people who work in culture rather than just enjoying it is, what's our responsibility in that case? If this is something that's not determined by one person, but determined by many, however large that group may be, what responsibilities do we have as people who create culture and protect culture and ensure that culture continues forward to make sure that we're speaking to our community? I think I just saw someone start to type a question. If you have any questions, please go ahead and continue to throw them into the conversation. So really what defines culture is two things. One, what we say, and what keeps happening. When we experience things and when culture is based in experiences, right, then it's not as much about what we say as it is about what we do. And when we set up programs, when we set up initiatives, when we do things, even when we're talking to people, the way we show up, the way we may treat them, all of that is going to shape their perspective of that moment, how they're feeling, what they're seeing going on around them. And yes, even what they hear is part of what shapes that perception. And so when it comes to understanding the culture in your community, we also have to understand what builds and breaks that culture. And so you're seeing on the slide right now a couple of examples of things that can absolutely build culture. But my question is, has anyone experienced the moments where culture breaks? Maybe a manager telling someone to stay in their lane in a meeting, and suddenly the meeting doesn't feel as collaborative anymore. Or, someone not having throws at Mardi Gras and still having their parade float. It feels a little weird at times. Has anyone experienced moments where culture just seems a little bit different from what was expected and what was communicated to what happened? Come through Railroad Ave.
Well, just recently, a route in our community that started our local Mardi Gras parade, our city decided that it would no longer follow this route, and much to the disappointment of our local citizens and the people who organized the Mardi Gras parade back in the 1990s, I think it was. And of course, we're waiting to see just how it's going to flow this year with the new route and no longer traveling the route that it originally traveled for since 1995, I think it was.
Wow. So tell me a little bit more. What do you think? And like some of this, you're going to feel like it's common sense. Just rock with me. I promise you. Uh,
Okay.
how big of a change is this for the community? What are some of the, how does this impact people in the community?
Well, number one, the original organizers were very disappointed. And of course, that caused some heated city council meetings. Um, Secondly, the route has been shortened extensively.
Mm,
And thirdly, it is believed by local residents that another route could have been taken that would have encompassed both. Our community is 80% African American, and the route now has the parade traversing down Main Street, which is predominantly a couple of businesses and is predominantly Caucasian.
mm,
So
mm.
that's you can understand why that council meeting was quite
Just a
productive
little
yet
heated.
non-productive. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about this because this is a perfect example of culture building and culture breaking. Mardi Gras is one of the most important things that can happen in Louisiana communities and culture as a regular thing that they can count on. One of the most important pieces of shared perception over time is repeatability, right? If we do something one time, it creates a nice moment. If we do something multiple times, like Mardi Gras, it's something the community can count on. And that's a great way to build morality, to build, engagement, and especially in places where we still deal with racial tones and racial and sometimes even soft segregation, right? That this is a time when even those people groups will mix. One parade plays a lot of heavy roles in the community. And so in a moment like this, moving from what sounds like a more residential area to a more commercial area, while it may sound like a good idea, you're also seeing very clearly the impacts it has on people who may not have been in that conversation. Do I have that right?
You're absolutely right. Yes, yes. So we've it's been pretty much finalized, and it became a very huge event. Economically speaking, individuals who were vendors who participated will be very much limited
Mm.
from this point on. So we just we're just trying to work with it at this stage.
I mean, and this is the challenge of the work, right? Is that sometimes things are going to come your way that you necessarily didn't get to see this curveball coming, but now it's here. And so the question is, what do you do? How do you alleviate the pain in this moment while also still working with local governance? And I love your example because it's exactly what we're about to get into next is if culture is shared perception over time and we're here to work to, bring people together to protect this culture, but we also understand that it can break, then we need to start mapping it and understanding exactly what's at risk in these situations. Now, a lot of times when governance, when any organization, public, private, nonprofit, a family's group, a leader by themselves makes a decision, they're usually thinking of it from a single perspective, right? Maybe there's a stakeholder involved. Maybe there are a couple of things that they're having to juggle at one time. And so they're trying to make the clearest call. One of the things that we don't see very often, it's the same reason that Seeker exists, is that many people don't look at the multiple people who are going to be impacted by a message. So when we talk about the Mardi Gras example or any example, I encourage you, if you have a piece of paper, try drawing this map out that you see on your slide right now. Start with the circle in the middle, and that's going to be your story. And we always start with that. In this case, that would be changing the Mardi Gras route, right? And then you'll see a circle outside of that circle. And really what we're saying here is, well, who makes up our community? Who makes up the environment in which this moment is happening around? And we're not just going to look at the people that we know or we like or even may look like or sound like us. We're going to look at as many as possible that we believe are going to be important in this conversation just because of their presence. And so I brought up a couple of examples, right? You'll see here just some classic ones. Long-term residents, people who have existed and lived in Louisiana for near a century or more. And then you have the newcomers like me. I'm from Atlanta originally. I moved to Louisiana in 2013. I moved to San Francisco in 2020. And so I was a transplant. You have the younger generations, the kids running around, screaming 6, 7 and doing all the silly stuff, right? And then, of course, you also have displaced communities. Now, you could do this with any groups. You could have the HOA presidents. You could have the Kiwanis Club. You could have any organization that you want or any people group here. But the main thought and the main reason you're doing this is you want to be able to say, okay, when we say this out loud, when this leaves our office, who's going to hear it and how are they going to react? And so we just ask the questions. How is a long-term resident going to feel about this? How is a transplant going to feel about this? Right now, in the Mardi Gras example, long-term resident, not going to be as happy that we're changing the Mardi Gras route. A transplant who doesn't understand the historical or cultural importance of Mardi Gras to the community on a local level may be excited that it's happening on Main Street. It seems more convenient, right? But as we're looking at these things, we're not just looking at their differences. As you see, there are some circles that overlap, that spell out overlap here, 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 and here. And so we're going to look for things that they have in common. Not necessarily positive, not necessarily negative, but places where their perspective overlaps. And so for Mardi Gras, it could be as simple as, for kids, they love the throws. They love being out of school. Transplants coming in from a college town, they love the throws. They love being out of school, right? And so those pieces, as well as the frustrations, people don't want to deal with the barricades getting put up. They find it frustrating driving and work when Mardi Gras season's going on, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to do our best to map out these different pieces. And we want to really focus on places of similarity between one or two groups. These are going to be places that I will call places of friction and resonance, which we'll talk about later. But this map is something that you can bring into any situation when you're talking about, hey, we want to do a program. How is it going to be received? Hey, we're thinking about saying this thing. Here's what we're really trying to communicate. How is this going to react in different people's contexts that shapes their perspective? How is this going to feel when someone who may watch Fox News sees it as compared to someone who watches NBC or listens to NPR? And look, we know these differences. We deal with them all the time, right? As we're talking to people, but a lot of times strategically, we don't bring them into a framework that allows us to prepare for their reactions. So keep this map. Understand that what we're really looking at is what we're trying to teach here. Now, let's work into an example because I want to make sure that we're cognizant of time. And of course, if you have questions, please continue to raise your hand and throw them into the chat. I will always stop to answer those pieces. So let's use an example. I brought up one of the most familiar phrases I could possibly think of from my time in Louisiana. One I'm sure you've all heard more times than you can count. Louisiana strong. So when that phrase pops up, it usually pops up in a couple of different contexts, right? Usually there's something that has happened in the community and the community is rounding together and the state is rousing together and you hear Louisiana strong. It could be after a terrible moment. It could be after a moment of crisis. It could be in a moment of giving, but this is a constant phrase. Just if, one, to make sure you guys are still tracking with me. If you've heard this phrase before, raise your hand. Okay, yes. All right. How would you just put into the chat? What do you think of when you hear this phrase? Or answer out loud. I'm down for both. Evelyn, what do you hear? What do you hear when you hear this phrase? I think she said platitudes, resilience. And I know that's a tricky word right now as well. Jelani, I see you working. Railroad Ave, you're putting it into, okay, cool. We're all throwing it into the chat. I love this. This makes me so happy. Proud. So there's a level of pride to it. Cultural preservation, togetherness, and resilience. These are all great. Now, a lot of times when we're doing programming, we're going to come from our perspective. So as we see the phrase Louisiana strong, as we think about using the phrase Louisiana strong, we may see it as a word of resilience. We may see it as a tone of pride. We may see it as platitudes. But it's not about our perspective. We're speaking to a perspective that's not our own. We're speaking to people outside of us. And that's the whole point of this map. So take a moment, draw the map out, and try to fill it in for Louisiana strong. Not based off of your perspectives, right? Not based off of how you feel about the word. Not that what you feel is not important, but we're putting that aside to speak to the culture. So how do each one of these groups, when they hear that phrase, what do they think? How do they react? And try to find at least one overlap. Railroad Ave, Evelyn, I just want to make sure. Do you guys have questions right now? I see your hands are still up from the exercise, but I want to check. And Elizabeth, welcome. We're so excited to have you here. We're doing a little exercise right now to understand how different people respond to the same piece of language. And so the example that we're using is Louisiana strong. You'll see that as the story here on the map. What we're asking everybody to do is take a moment and think about how each one of the groups on this map right now, long-term residents, younger generations, transplants, displaced communities, how each one of them may respond to that phrase. And we're going to look to find at least one overlap between two of those groups of something that they may find similar. Now, our goal isn't positivity or negativity. We're not here to compliment or critique. We're here just to understand how people's perspectives are mapped out and what that feels like. And once you think you feel good with your first overlap, go ahead and raise your hand because let's have some conversation around this. Tara, what do you have so far?
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Okay,
You're
okay,
good.
cool. No, I was trying to figure it out myself. Okay. I think maybe I might be a little more jaded than some of our group compatriots. I think an overlap between the next generation and long-time residents would be just it's a little stagnant. It's it dredges up mental imagery from a time past where like our infrastructure failed us in a way that was tragic, and I feel like it maybe doesn't like I'm a younger person and I'm also a lifetime resident of Louisiana, and so I feel like it has been slapped on to efforts to alleviate problems in the past that were not treated the best. And so when I hear it, it's just very like, you know, okay, yeah, thoughts and prayers.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely understand that perspective. You've seen how it's been used. I mean, this is a phrase I want to say has been used consistently since at least Katrina, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an exceptionally long time for any one piece of language to stay, consistently pushed. Now, if you acknowledge your own personal bias, and I want to give you credit for that, you admitted your own perspective with it, and that's an important part in what we're dealing with from a cultural fluency level. If we can't acknowledge where our perspectives are, where the strengths of them are, sometimes the weaknesses of them are, then we can't address how we're going to be able to work with larger groups of people. So as you're looking at the overlap, now I want you to, you don't have to share this part out loud, but take some time to think about the side that's completely opposite to your perspective. And where are these people? Who are they? And how do they feel? And why do they feel that way? Jeloni, I know that you just put your hand down, but please, if you're still interested, go ahead. Jeloni, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. I see you're unmuted though.
Okay, I looked at one side of the map and longtime residents and next generation. And be it our joys we celebrate or experiences that are not so joyful, that's where I believe there's an overlap. And it also overlaps when it comes to tragedy or hurricanes with transplants as well as displaced individuals dealing with the tragedy, be it a hurricane or um, neighborhood unrest and what have you.
Yeah.
I also saw an overlap, or believe there's an overlap, when it comes to transplants and displaced individuals who may have relocated to our area, which would be considered transplants also, I believe. Um, it's trying to understand the culture and really wanting to assimilate and be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That assimilation piece is key, right? When we talk about transplants, when we talk about people coming into an area, the desire to be part of the larger conversation and the larger shared perspective that's been built out of this context. I remember my first time going to a Cajun Mardi Gras out in like Crowley. And they had the greased pole. And like, I'm from Atlanta. I've never seen anything like that. But in that moment, as a very much city kid with super muddy Air Force Ones on because no one told me that we were going to a farm that day, I'm not going to stop and say, oh, I don't belong here. I want to be a part of what's going on because of the joy and everything else and everybody else is experiencing. Right? That's a huge component anytime someone steps in. Joloni, let's try it again. Okay, I think there's something going on with your audio there. You may just have to throw it into the chat. I'm so sorry. I see that you're trying to talk, but it's not coming through. Try throwing it into the chat. I'm gonna keep talking. I'm not gonna ignore the conversation though. So throw it in there, and once it pops up on my side, I'll respond to it so that I can speak to that as well. Now, as you're doing this map, right, it's tricky, and I'm not gonna say that it's not, because for this time you have to set aside your own personal context and think about people that you may not have considered in this way before. But that's the work of working in culture. As we want to make changes in our community on a level that feels impossible, we have to consistently get buy-in and build faith with areas that we may not necessarily rock with on a regular basis. I've got my own political views. I've got my own personal beliefs and things like that. And a lot of times in doing market research, from politics to launching products and different campaigns and stuff like that, a lot of times we just have to understand, well, who are the people who are here? Not who do I want them to be, or who are the people that I would hang out with, even though I do look for those eventually, right? And that's where this map starts. Now, you can use this map, actually, before we move on to another slide, you can use this map anytime. When you're trying to figure out the ramifications or the consequences of what you're about to do from a cultural level, if you're going to change the Mardi Gras, right, the Mardi Gras route, you can actually run this resonance map. You can run this cultural map and say, what are the perspectives that this is going to impact? What are the places of overlap? Jelani, looking at your answer. Okay, so transplant and displaced communities overlap. Yes, you mentioned your displacement in South Mississippi after Katrina. Absolutely. So, a lot of times, as you're seeing here, that there's displacement that continues to pop up, right? That there are ways that things pop up in different contexts, being moved from Atlanta to Louisiana, even having friends move from New York to Atlanta. Displacement can be a similar experience that takes on different contexts depending on that person. But what you're identifying is a critical thing, that regardless of how different it is, it's still displacement. There's still a transition that's happening here. And that means that there's an experience that people can and hold on to. That's a moment of shared perspective, that people know what it means to move in a moment of crisis. And so when we have a map like this, what we really want to do is focus on those overlaps, focus on those areas where we can speak to multiple people at the same time, or we're looking at the perspectives of multiple people at the same time. And again, it could be something that they're angry about. And I want to be super clear about that, because a lot of times in culture work, people look at the positives and then they do their overlapping and they go, well, there's no real overlap between these guys on a positive level. If we look at it just overall, they may be angry about the same things. They may not be thrilled about the level of taxes in their community, right? They may be upset at environmental issues or storm drainage or whatever these things may be that impact their regular life. But if you find what those are, that's going to give you places for you to do your work. What do I mean? So when we're talking about an area, right, that is an area of overlap, we're speaking to multiple groups, yes. And to each one of those groups, we're communicating something. Every action that we take, as you've experienced in your own work, communicates something whether we want it to or not. There have been times where if you're at dinner with friends and if you stand up at the most awkward moment, then it suddenly takes on a lot more weight than you just having to use the bathroom. Right? We all have different actions that take on different contexts and different perspectives as these things go on. But in our work, because we're working at a larger scale of people, we have the responsibility to look at this at a more standardized level and more of a practice and a process. And so we have to ask the question, what are we teaching? Not just are we being efficient, not just are we doing the thing that we want to get done, but in the way that we get it done, what are we teaching? And so I think the example I have here is pretty ties in pretty well. When recovery resources go to tourist districts and residential neighborhoods last, people in those communities learn that economic image matters more than community stability. Now, a lot of us have experienced this in one way or another. Now, this is not saying that system, not to say that they're not either, but this is not saying that the system is intentionally avoiding a certain community. That could be the case. But it also could just be how things are rolling out in this time. As we've seen, bureaucratic processes have their own way of working. The problem that we're dealing with is how it reflects and what that communicates. And that if we don't have anything planned for the lesson that's being taught, then people can take a lot of things out of it. And based off of that context, they then get to create a story that can share and that can spread. If we have a program that's accessible, say it's this workshop, right? And it's accessible to the public, but it's hosted by the state. And someone comes to the state and says, hey, I need training or I need resources around cultural fluency. And they go, great, we do these workshops. We've shared it on social media. We have it on our website. We have it in all these places. And they go, well, I didn't know about any of that. This doesn't mean it wasn't communicated. It doesn't even mean it wasn't communicated efficiently or effectively. What it means is that because this person did not hear about it until the moment that they're having this conversation, that we can deal with a potential reflection here of them saying, well, they don't care. And it's like, well, if they don't care, they wouldn't work for the state. But this is the reckoning of the work, right? And so in these moments, as you're providing resources to people, you're going to deal with the same thing. As you're asking for resources, the way we ask, the way we do funding, the way we do development, the way we build out our communities, there's always subtext. And the tricky thing with culture is that if we don't take time to actually sit down and ask what that subtext is going to be for this people group, whether that be long-term residents, whether that be our developers and our funders, whether that be participants or students or camp counselors or whatever group that you want to fill in on your chart, we have to also ask, what are we teaching them? And then we have to decide, is that what we want to teach them? So when we have those moments of when we're asked those questions, we're going to come to two answers. Either the thing that we're teaching them breaks culture, like we talked about earlier, or it builds it. And so we're going to look at two different things. And you know, in those moments where things are breaking is when the work feels completely impossible. I remember working on the Confederate statue in Lafayette, Louisiana, that had a federal injunction on it. And for years, we like really just kicked around the tires trying to figure out how do we deal with this specific situation. And it felt impossible because there was so much friction and so many different perspectives coming from so many different angles that it was hard to find a way where we could build culture that brings people together. But once we figured out places of resonance, in this case, financial responsibility, paying taxes on a statue, then we can start to make things move. Now, is that the most, I don't have a better word for this, I apologize, the sexiest way to do this? No. But does it get it done in a way that is sustainable, that doesn't burn you out, that doesn't burn your team out, and doesn't upset the community any more than they already are? Absolutely. Tara, what you got?
Can you say the thing you just said again about what the solution to that was about the homeowners and the pay? Like, can you just say that sentence again? What was the solution to the statue thing about the taxes?
Yeah, so we realized that if we talked about racism as a major proponent behind this statue, that the residents of this town or the conversation wasn't ready for a conversation on race because of the current environments, the other contexts that were going on. We were in the middle of another tough presidency and had other local issues that were happening. And so we switched our language to being about financial responsibility and saying like, hey, I don't want my tax dollars to support this statue. And that worked really well because in our overlap mapping, what we realized is that 3 out of 4 people groups on our residence map hated paying taxes. And 1 out of 4 of the groups was deeply concerned about systemic racism. Now, when I was younger, I would get really upset that more people weren't concerned about systemic racism. But we learned that if we wanted to get that statue out of here, we needed to figure out places of resonance, places of overlap and value. Thanks. You can do this. You can absolutely do this. And you won't have to go bald like I did. You can get through the stress of it without it being this insane thing. And I know it's tough because when we get passionate about this stuff, we go directly to what we know is the issue. And if we attack that issue head on, we deal with friction. I'm sure you have. There has to be at least one program that has been an uphill fight since the day you thought of it. And there are a million reasons that you could point to why it's an uphill fight. Each one of those reasons is perspective that's been shattered. And so, and not including our own, right? That we're coming in from our own perspective. That's why we're in the work. And so we look at what's going to close the gap, what's going to bring people together for us to make this move. And so usually I use a phrase system like this. What we want is moments of people coming together to become the proof that we need that we're doing the work. So here we'll say something to the effect of, we're rewarding X to teach this so that our culture is filling in this gap or this opening that is really causing issues. Let me give you an example because I know this is a form, but keep this form in mind. Another version. When we do X, when we change our Mardi Gras parade route, people learn about economic prioritization in their community. To change that instruction, we'll add additional programming to the new parade route or something to that effect, or we'll do something else, or we'll do a walking parade. But essentially the options start to appear once we realize what we're really dealing with there. And we'll know it worked if this happens. And that's critical. You've got to set a goal or a measurement piece because culture is a process. Defining culture, building culture, protecting culture, all of it is technically a science. And so what we need to do is understand that if the action that we're taking, it should have a response, and we should be able to see what that response is. So let's see how this works out. Here's an example. When we fund visible recovery projects that don't reach residential neighborhoods first, people learn economic image matters more than community stability. That's where a lot of us are taught to stop. But this is where the work begins. All we've done is just set the stage. So to change that instruction, we're not changing the entire system. We're not changing the whole application process. We're looking really closely at the application process, and we're going to see if we can get the allocation criteria to change to prioritize community-led proposals, not to discriminate against non-community-led proposals, but to encourage community-led proposals. And we'll know if it worked if we do a standing on the corner survey and ask residents to name 3 recovery efforts led by people that they know. What we've done in this moment is we've focused on the perspective and the perception rather than the system itself. We understand that there may be multiple steps into a community funding process. And if you try to attack all of that at once, you're going to get exhausted and it's not going to move. There are too many moving gears. It's a system. But if we take a look at one of the gears and we start there and say, how do we make this change that at least opens it in conversation or makes it feel this way to drive this goal, then we can see these things happen. Now, what does this really mean? It means that in all honesty, no matter where you are in the United States, no matter where you are in the world, change is always the enemy. People hate change. They're terrified of it. It scares us. We want to do mostly the same thing every day if we can. And so when we talk about changing things for the better, the first word is still change. And so as passionate as we may be in those moments, we have to be very careful about how much we throw onto someone else in changing their perception at one moment. I've had a lot of conversations with people. I did a lot of anti-racist work in Louisiana, as you may assume at this point. And I had a lot of conversations with people where they would come from their own racial biases. And as much as I wish I could talk them through what, Dr. King's letters from Birmingham jail or W.E.B.'s pieces on dual consciousness, that's not going to work here. And I need to respect their human context well enough to understand that. And say, rather than trying to tell you that everything is broken, even though I do believe that it may be, let's start with just where did you hear? Where's the first Black person you met? Let's start small. Now, once you do that, do it in a public or a visible context. I'm not saying shout it from the rooftops. And here's a huge difference. When you shout things from the rooftops, people expect a show. If you're not putting together a massive systemic change, you're working on something that you know is a long game, which a lot of culture work is, then us shouting from the rooftops doesn't help our cause. However, us making sure that people know what we're doing on a regular basis is extremely important. Transparency reports, updates, press interviews, small pieces, not just when we have new things to announce, but when we're working through the issues that matter. And then finally, don't announce it like a revolution. Is it a revolution? Absolutely. You're changing the way that your communities work and thrive and live and breathe. But if you call it a revolution, you're going to scare a lot of folks. And you're going to scare some of your allies, not just your enemies. It takes a community to do the work that you're doing. And so as you do cultural design, that's what we call this, As you understand multiple perspectives, that's what we call cultural fluency, then you're diving in deeper here. You're able to come out and say, this is what we need to do to achieve equity in our community. And then you get to work towards that goal. Cultural fluency is how to read the system. Anytime you're dealing with multiple parties involved, even when you're dealing with one party involved, run the resonance map, run that cultural exercise of doing the little circles, picking your audiences, and asking yourself about those overlaps. Build it your own way. It doesn't have to be circles. I just happen to like circles. Our logo has a circle in it, and so we try to use circles a lot. But build that map, run that map, keep that map in your mental back pocket, because you will do this work even more than I do. But when we do it, these are the tools that we rely on to make sure that when we step out, we're stepping out in a way that brings as many people behind the work that we're doing as possible, because we don't have time to waste. It's not about us, it's about the community to begin with, just like it is for you. Now, do you have any questions, any thoughts, anything you want me to go back to? I've saved some time just to let's dive into what's going on for you guys. Tara.
Hey, so we are pretty dependent on our economic development group. And there has been so I work at an art museum.
Okay.
And we are a publicly funded art museum, and I am the development person. We work with our economic development group, and they have had their own internal turmoil in regards to race, and it's currently ongoing, where the white board members refuse to put in replace themselves with acting board members, and so the only acting board members currently is a group of older black men, and so there's all of this infighting. And through part of that, they have, reassessed their funding priorities, and are, I don't want to say lashing out, but it is, their internal explosion is touching everything.
Yeah.
And so we're having a hard time navigating that, as it's really delicate in their situation is delicate in and of itself. But we are asking them for money and trying to we have our own priorities, but we also try to hear the concerns of all of the groups that we are partners with.
Sure.
And so we've targeted a lot of our funding to align with the new board's, preferences, but there's a disconnect between it is my opinion that their opinion of us is not as optimistic as we would hope. We're actively pursuing change and programming at the request of our community, which includes them, and then it's an ongoing thing where the rumors we hear back is that no one sees that change. So I guess if you have advice about how to make our efforts more visible in regards to aligning with progressive change.
Sure. That's a really good question. You're dealing with multiple perspectives here. It sounds like you have the public perspective on you guys are working in change, but they're not seeing change. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, cool. And then you have the economic development authority of sorts that is dealing with their own infighting, which makes it harder to receive funding to fund that change.
Yes.
And of course, that economic agency is probably also dealing with public perception on them giving funding to an agency or an organization that the public doesn't necessarily, or at least a section of the public doesn't necessarily feel is making change.
Yes.
Okay, sticky situation. So who do we really have to win over here? It's not the Economic Development Authority. Yes, we do have to maintain a good relationship with them. And if they're going through some mess right now, we want to figure out the best way to not let that mess spread to us. 100%.
Yes.
The public is the battle. right? Where if you have constituents from the economic authority saying, hey, we're not feeling like these guys are really helping our community, that makes it harder for the economic authority to justify the funding. Now, usually what happens, and I Francesca and I met by working at an arts organization, so this is actually a really funny example for me. As you are dealing with sharing to the community what you do and that you're providing a change, what that requires is a deep, deep understanding into how the community measures change and where they want to see change right now. And then what is the overlap between the change they want to see and your mission and vision as an organization? It may be something you're already doing, right? And then at that point, because you know the priorities on the change they want to see, those become the priorities for your communication campaigns, for emails, for things like that that go out to the public, not just to your members. And then you look at public ways to share that information. One of the best things you could do, one of my least favorite moves, was doing an interview with the local news at ungodly times in the morning. I think I did most of my interviews between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., and I hated every moment of it, but it was the best way for us to appear in a non-revolutionary, non-announcing capacity in front of the community, where suddenly we can build out a program or we can build out a relationship with that news organization, with that newspaper, with that media group or social media influencer, take your pick, that can come alongside us in a ongoing conversation on the change we're trying to make in the area that the public wants to see. You're not promising immediate fixes. If you do that, you'll end up in the exact same heat bucket that a lot of nonprofits do when change takes time. But if you can create the story that you're actively working towards it, which you are, that's why you're at the work, right? You just have to take a little bit more time on creating that story in a way that I like to say is palatable, but is really perceivable by the public, that they will embrace. And then bringing that back to the economic authority while they're handling their mess, because you can't really control their infighting as much, you can get the public on your side. Now, that's where another resonance map comes into play, right? Because the public is made up of multiple groups. And so it's understanding those groups. What do they want? What do they need? And what are the overlaps that if you were to solve one problem would affect multiple people?
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes. And also I think the thing about the news and like going on and not announcing it as a big thing. So like we do have relationships with news stations and we go on pretty regularly, but we go on to announce programming that is like happening. Like, oh, we go on like 2 weeks before and we're like, hey, there is this event on this day. But I think maybe going on and just talking about like, here's what we have planning here, because like we're having this thing where we're trying to invite community members into the museum to give us their opinion, and then we can't get anyone to give us their opinion. And so it's like a self-perpetuating loop of like, okay, you guys are mad at us, tell us what you want differently, and then it's just crickets. And then we're like, okay, and we try to do our best, and then when it comes around, we do a thing, and then people come back and they're like, this is not it. And we're like, okay, what do you want? And then crickets. And then we just do that in a circle. So yeah, I think going on and being like on the like instead of using that time every time to be like, we're having an event in 2 weeks, be like, we would love you to come share your opinion on this thing.
Well, that you got to think about your own personal perspective, right? How does it feel when you see those on the news that ask for your opinion, or they say, come down here and talk to us? There's a buy-in that's required to do so. And so sometimes, like even one of our hardest things is getting people's opinions. We run
Yes.
surveys all the time. I do in-depth interviews. They're very tricky. My favorite way of doing interviews is at a bar, because alcohol opens every conversation. And when you're working for a public or open organization that serves the public, then anybody becomes a valuable point of research, as long as they're aware or not aware that you exist. And so sitting down with someone and saying, oh yeah, I work for this organization, have you heard of us? Is going to start the conversation for a lot of people. Now, we also have to think about it's the review situation. Who are the people who write Yelp reviews? People who had really bad times or really good times, or just really love Yelp. But it's never the average consumer. And so the same thing applies with bringing them to your building. Who are the people who are going to show up if they give an opinion? The people who had a really bad time, the people who had a really good time, or the people who love museums? That's a small section of the public. And so what you want to do is figure out ways of where are people already gathering? Where do people already share their opinions? How do we engage with them there? How do we turn our social media into a place where they feel like they can just be honest with us in our comments? Or how do we do this at a level where they know they can talk to me personally? Francesca knows that was a big move for me in like working with the community, was like, hey, don't even worry about my work email. Here's my personal cell phone number. Let's chat. Let's grab food. And then hearing about their concerns directly, bringing that back to the office and saying, what can we do? You're going to have to go outside. Sometimes organizations provide umbrellas, right? It's a safe space to be, but sometimes you got to get out in the rain with everybody else too. As for the news piece, yeah, don't just make it about the things that you need. Make it about the expertise that you're providing in this community. You guys are experts. You run a museum. That like, to the public, that already makes you an expert, right? Like if a police chief shows up on the news, they're gonna be like, whoa, he has something to say. I got to listen to this. It doesn't have to be about the specific news or the most upcoming things that are happening or what you're focused on. It can actually be, and we've run this before, ran this in Knoxville, Tennessee for like 6 months. We built an employment program with the news station where we talked about job tricks to get hired. We're working for a job board. So it was like resume tips. Here's how you review a resume. Here's how you apply for a job. Here's what's happening in the workforce right now. And we talked about that twice a week for 6 months. We never made an ask on the news. But when we showed up in the community and we said, hey, we're the guys who were on the news, trust was there. And so, you know, it's a stage. You get to determine all the different avenues that you can do, what you can do at this stage.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions before we wrap up? Awesome. Well, Francesca, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to hand it back over to you.
No, thank you so much, Evan. This was really helpful and informative. Thank you also to those who joined us today. I hope you got something out of Evan's presentation. I know I definitely did. I think we're going to also send out a copy of the worksheet following this presentation so you can have that map on hand. It looks like we have one last thing that's coming up in the chat. Great, good. I'm glad y'all enjoyed it.
I hope this helps in the work that you're doing, because the work you're doing is really important, and I want to support you any way I can.